Hey, hi, how are you? Welcome to Hazard Identification and Assessment and Control. To be honest, safety starts here. Everything in safety has to do with any one or all of these steps. Now, most folks think it's only the control part that we need to worry about. But as we move through this course, you'll see that there's more to it than putting on a hard hat and hoping you don't get beamed by a falling object. Let's dive in. In this episode, it's what is a hazard and why should you care? And so why should you care? Let's deal with the first hurdle, and that's actually understanding what a hazard is and what it isn't. I guess what we need to go over with to begin with is what exactly a hazard is. Now, there's endless definitions. Everyone has their own definition of what a hazard is, or at least their own point of view. Now, having said that, let's give some credibility to that, shall we? Well, before we go too far, one word of warning here, you need to check your jurisdiction first. Regardless of what I say or other authorities on the subject, aligning your health and safety program or health and safety management system with the legislation is always the best bet. In fact, it's a must. However, that being said, it doesn't mean you can't exceed the legislated requirements, especially if adopting best practices would mean those requirements now become boundaries. So you need to also consider the next question is, do you need to personalize a definition? If there's room to expand upon what the legislation says, it not only adds that personal angle for your organization and also helps to emphasize or put emphasis to the impact because of that personalization, well, then the answer is yes. However, most of the time it isn't necessary. I want you to think safety is more than just copying and pasting the legislation into a manual and prefacing it with, do this. Let's get on to the next bit, and that's some definitions. Let's talk about some definitions. Now, here in Canada, we have a federal organization called the CCOHS, which is the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. A little bit about them. They're a federal department corporation, and the CCOHS is governed by a tripartite council representing government, employers, and labor. And this is done to ensure a balanced approach to workplace health and safety issues. Anyway, here's their definition of a hazard. It's any source of potential damage, harm, or adverse health effects on something or someone. I'm based in Alberta here, so I'm going to give a shout out to the province and where I make my home. So here is the definition used here in Alberta. Incidentally, it's only located in the actual legislation, in the definitions part of the legislation, not anywhere else. And so what Alberta says, it's any situation, condition, or thing that may be dangerous to health and safety. I like it because it's simple. For my friends in the South, here's the definition from OSHA. And it says a hazard is often associated with a condition or activity that, if left uncontrolled, can result in an injury or illness. In case there are folks who haven't seen my previous videos on hazard assessment or safety culture, here's the definition that I work with most of the time, and it'll be featured quite a bit throughout this course. And that is, a hazard is something that has the potential for negative effect on anyone or anything it interacts with, possibly resulting in injury or illness to people, damage to property and or assets, or harm to the environment. To put it in the simplest terms, a hazard that is something that has the potential to result in loss. Now, the most important thing to understand is a hazard left uncontrolled leads to a loss. In fact, to go further, every single workplace incident is caused by the presence of an uncontrolled hazard. Now, here's the confusing part. Too often, the first mistake made when performing a hazard assessment is the folks doing the hazard assessment will focus on the result, the consequence, not the cause. For example, you might have seen hazard assessments noting cuts as a hazard, when actually the hazard is exposure to sharp edges. So we need to consider hazards with the following descriptors. And the first one is contact with. This is contact with sharp edges, a rough surface, contact with heat, extreme cold, etc. An influence that's going to cause injury and immediate trauma through contact. The next one is being exposed to. exposed to sharp edges, rough surface, heat, extreme cold, etc. You heard that before. But it's an influence that is going to cause injury by being exposed to, but also not necessarily something that can be touched. Think noise, for instance, or radiation, or extreme environmental temperatures. The next one is loss or deprivation of. While we might have the presence of ice on a sidewalk, it's also the loss of friction. Consider that analogy when examining a situation for hazards. If there's no presence of, is there a loss of or a deprivation of? Here's one to ponder. Those of you watching on YouTube can leave me a comment, if you will, or you on the learning platform, you can feel free to reach out by email. But what if you have flimsy guardrails? Yes, there's a safeguard, but not adequate. Is it a deprivation or a loss of the safeguard? Now, the next one is the presence of. We talked about the absence of or the deprivation of. Now we have the presence of, and conversely, the absence of. Think also those things that can't necessarily be touched. Like light, for instance. There's the presence of poisonous gases or vapors or fumes, but also, conversely, the absence of oxygen. Entering a steel tank can also be an environment that's absent of oxygen due to rust in the oxygenation process. However, think also the absence of normal safeguards, just like I mentioned before, the absence of guardrails. And the next one is the reduction of or the increase of. Oxygen might not be absent, but reductions below 19.5% in the atmosphere is also hazardous to the health. We need that 21%. Conversely, an increase in inerting gases can also cause that reduction. Like think of an increase in nitrogen. But also gradual increases of other things or other accumulations can cause problem. Think and put it in the idea of that frog in the boiling water. Put them in the water, they don't notice, and you keep turning the temperature up until all of a sudden, bam. Let's have a look now at sources of hazards. Okay? We need to understand that sources of hazards should be noted in the order that's most difficult to influence. To redirect, if you will, I'm pretty sure everyone has heard these at one time or another. I put them in the order that's most difficult to influence or manage. And that is, first one is people. And that's not just co-workers, but other people in the environment, contractors, service providers, visitors, etc. on the job site. The next one is environment. This is the working environment. Don't necessarily think all green on me, but think the working environment. Once again, we think of those sources of hazards. Is there too much noise in the environment? Is it not light enough? Is it too dark, etc.? Next is the equipment and machinery that people work with. Might be something as much as powered mobile equipment such as forklifts, but all the way down to hand tools such as screwdrivers, hammers, wrenches, etc. And then finally, the materials. These could be hazardous materials, acids and alkalis and caustics and things like that, and even paints. But think of benign things like flour, etc. for baking, or wax for floors, etc. All of these are the materials you work with, and they can be a source of a hazard. We classify hazards into two groups, okay? Safety and health hazards. Safety hazards are immediate hazards and are likely to cause immediate trauma to the body. Think back to that icy sidewalk I was talking about as a safety hazard, or working at heights with no fall protection. Consider this if it makes it easier. A safety hazard can be where an external force can be exerted on the body. Now, the next one we have are health hazards. And health hazards are usually more internal harm or harm to health. Think exposure to poisons, toxins, radiation, etc. But also exposure to certain things over time, like high levels of noise over time. The thing to remember is incorrect identifications of hazards will more often than not result in the incorrect selection and application of controls. We've talked about sources of hazards: people, environment, tools and machinery, and of course, materials. And we've separated the hazards into two classes, safety and health. Let's drill down a little bit further and talk about the categories of hazards. Okay, the first one is physical. These are, more often than not, with physical hazards, think of physical harm to the body. Like we can have tripping hazards and where that trauma is exerted on the body. But physical hazards can also be extreme cold or extreme heat. Think also that working environment. Now, the next one we have is chemical hazards. Those rate back to the materials that we're using, but also chemicals that may be present in the atmosphere, the working environment as well. We can think back or think about biological hazards, and most people with the pandemic, the plague, shall we say, everybody is really aware of viral hazards. There's also things like bacteria, mold, and things like that. And then finally, we have psychosocial hazards. And these are things like bullying, harassment, vicarious trauma when we see other things happening to other people, etc. It all affects the emotional and mental state and mental health of workers. We've talked about all of these, but we have to understand that exposure to hazards can have very negative effects: injury, illness, damage to property and the environment, and of course, property and assets. But we have to understand that incorrectly identifying them means a greater exposure to risk and therefore loss. That being said, the next thing is, well, it's quiz time. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're not already subscribed, you should click that video or click that subscribe button right down here and ring the little bell, and you'll get notified when the next video launches. Provided that is you click that little bell. If you're on the learning platform, there's a short quiz that you'll need to take in order to ensure this module is complete. Once that's done, you can move on to the next module, which is understanding controls. Oh, and for you folks on YouTube, you can check out this video up here. Remember, safety leaders, being leaders doing the right thing in the right place at the right time, regardless of who's watching, well, because more than likely someone is watching. Okay? Take care. Bye for now.